women need to have the same opportunities to shape digital technologies.
I am turning to all women active and interested in digitalization.
And position young women and girls as not only consumers but also producers within the digital sector.
The industry is ready to embrace us all, and when we get into the industry, we will shape our own future.
Hello and welcome to Women Leading Digital, a podcast by GIZ where we discuss digital transformation and technology with leading voices from around the world. My name is Martina Karaparusheva, an advisor with the data economy team at GIZ. In our episode, we look at what happens when sectors don't just say they will design and promote an inclusive data economy, but actually do so.
We find that governments working on their own are not able to cope. So hence the importance of public-private partnership.
You see that Africa is progressively having more women in power. There are also women in the room trying to ensure that gender inequality matters are being addressed.
The World Economic Forum estimated that the value of integrated data use in 2025 will reach about 500 billion US dollars in India alone. That's a lot of potential. But how do we ensure that happens? The private sector often owns data, can share data and extract value from data. It also creates economic value from the analysis and creates jobs and employment possibilities for women. On the public side, public policy holds the responsibility of creating the data economy architecture and addressing legal, market, and social aspects to ensure representation and inclusion. But is this happening? Are the private and public sectors working together to make it happen? Today, we explore the current challenges and possible solutions in these sectors. Joining me for the discussion, we have Thelma Quaye and Treasure Maphanga. Thelma is currently the Chief Digital Infrastructure, Skills and Empowerment Officer at Smart Africa, an organization that works to accelerate sustainable socio-economic development by leveraging digital transformation. Hello, Thelma.
Hi, Martina. Good to be here with you today.
Treasure Maphanga is the Chief Operating Officer at AeTrade Group, a diaspora-led social enterprise spearheading inclusive digital transformation in Africa. Hello, Treasure.
Hi, Martina. Hi, Thelma. It's great to be with both of you today.
Thank you both for coming. Thelma, there's currently a lot of pressure on the public sector to create a framework for a functioning and thriving data economy, especially in Africa, that includes women and gives them opportunities to participate in that data economy.
Yes.
What role do you think the public sector plays in addressing these needs?
So I think the public sector really has a pivotal role to play in creating an inclusive data economy. So for instance, when it comes to infrastructure, traditionally, private sector has taken the lead in digital infrastructure in Africa. And the private sector would invest in areas where they are going to make returns, right? And if you look at current coverage gap in Africa, it's really because the areas that are not covered are not necessarily very attractive to these private sector members. And so this is where the public sector comes in to intervene using certain instruments like the Investor Access Funds and even other regulatory policies to be able to foster an inclusive digital infrastructure. Not only building it, but also making it usable, meaningful, and most importantly, affordable in the case of Africa.
And Treasure, you were a part of the public sector and have since moved on into the private sector. What role do you see the private sector having in driving women's participation in data economy? Is infrastructure at the core of the issue, as Thelma mentioned, or is it something else?
Absolutely. The infrastructure is just a part. We also have an understanding that, especially in Africa, there's a huge gap in skills, as Thelma has mentioned. And I think the capacity building and actually working on providing digital literacy programs. The other is investments. We know Africa is a youthful continent. We have at least 30 million school leavers every year. And we find that governments working on their own are not able to cope. So hence the importance of public-private partnerships. Also, when you look at the landscape on the continent, most of our private companies and actors are micro and they're small businesses. It's important to factor this in, especially because we find that the majority of women are finding themselves either, creating these enterprises, running them, leading them. And so all the challenges that come with being small or micro are also now being transported from the economy as it existed, and we're bringing it into this increasingly digital economy. I'd love to hear also, your views, Thelma, on this.
I totally agree with Treasure's submission. And what we have been doing in supporting the government is to create a startup policy. Now, what the policy does is to help these governments understand, because when we started, you'd be surprised that a lot of these governments did not understand the benefit of supporting the youth. But we've come a long way. We've supported, I believe, about 10 countries to develop their local startup policies, and it's really thriving. So you would have certain things like tax holidays for the startups, or something called startup visa, so that if somebody is doing a tech entrepreneurship driven startup, it's easy for that person to move from one country to the other.
Building on what you both have said, do you think that this visibility has shed more light on gender inequality, and have either of you noticed any changes as a result?
Definitely, I think there has been some change. However, are we moving as fast as we should? I'm not sure. And if we want to be able to create a lasting change, advocacy just doesn't cut it.
To Thelma's point, I think greater awareness and advocacy that is building up on the continent has been useful. But when we look at the gender gap, for me, I think it's huge. If you're a female that is from Africa raising funds in venture capital for a tech initiative, you don't have the same equal chance as your male counterparts. There is still this bias that I think we are bringing into this new exciting data economy that we really have to address. We are working, for example, on capacity building for small businesses, for women and youth. When you register on our site, for example, you have a few basic questions to complete, but nobody said to us it's mandatory to put in a field for gender. So it is at the discretion of stakeholders what kind of data they're collecting in the private sector about who is active. So these are some of the improvements that would help, and not just to have visibility, but to actually have better data sets.
We're seeing a big push to create a single digital market, and there are currently a lot of countries that are changing their policies. From your experience, do you see women's voices being heard in the design of these changes?
When I go into policy meetings, specifically for data, I find a lot of women. There are also women in the room trying to ensure that gender inequality matters are being addressed. The question we need to answer is, will it be implemented? For those of us at the forefront, we also need to have that responsibility to make sure that things that government said they would do, we hold them accountable for it. It's very important. I mean, policies have been done through my lifetime, but what's important is that we need to make sure there's implementation and there's accountability.
And Treasure, as a woman acting in the private sector, do you think that with this push for new policies, enough progress has been made for you, but also other women, to profit from these changes?
I believe that we have made progress indeed, and I think it's important to celebrate every milestone. But I want to just switch and look at the majority of women who are not as privileged as Thelma and myself to have access. When you visit marketplaces in Africa, for example, what is remarkable is actually the use of cellular phones, mobile phones. Everybody who is in some possibility to get that device, they've started the journey. But I think that there's still a significant gap in giving voice to those people that are the users. They feel being put into the side of being recipients, and they're not co-creating the new economy that is emerging. They are not yet empowered with all the information. So I really appreciate the fact that there is a push, but I think the issue is, how is the private sector and civil society pushing?
While more can be done, You have both mentioned that progress has been made and we are seeing change. As we look towards solutions, Treasure, do you have any examples of women being involved and represented on a policy level that we can draw inspiration from?
When it comes to digital trade and the African continental free trade area, I think that there has been an intentionality about having stakeholder engagements to understand the single market that we're creating. What are the expectations specifically of women? What are the expectations of youth as a group? And how do we craft a protocol in a free trade agreement, which I understand is quite unique when you look at the world, because most free trade agreements don't consider these issues as deliberately as we are seeking to do in the continent. The champion for the Women in Trade Protocol is the president of Tanzania, who is an elected, the sitting woman leader who is running a country.
And Thelma, do you have examples out of Rwanda or with the work that you did with Smart Africa?
I like Treasure's example of the market women. In Africa, the market women are very powerful, and it's important that whatever policy that we are putting in place, we consult them. And so, for instance, in our e-commerce project, we did consultation and we consulted market women. We went on ground to Uganda, to Zimbabwe, and we consulted market women. And the sort of feedback we got was incredible on cross-border data flow. The sort of intelligence you get is incredible. My experience as a woman may be different from the market woman, but their voice also matters. And so in our consultation process, it's important that we involve everybody.
Treasure, I see you have something to add. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I think what we do need to do, though, in my view, is to build more deliberately that strong ecosystem so we can sustain, and that we don't have these interventions as sporadic, and that the consultations don't go away as soon as there is an instrument. Following through the whole policy cycle, I think, is something that needs to be improved. And I have seen, for example, countries saying, right, we've now signed up to the AfCFTA, we have ratified, we now have a strategy document that we're putting together. But many times I worry that those initiatives may not be sustained simply because the investments are not there, or there's a reliance on an external partner who has had the goodwill to get the journey started. But I think it's the issue now of how do we take ownership and continue to drive.
I agree. These solutions of more inclusion, more representation, more attention to the issues of women and other marginalized people, they need to have longevity. So how do you see us building a sustainable and thriving data economy of the future?
So I think women are resilient to start with. You just need to give them the right environment and they are going to thrive. And so for me, the future is bright. But how does it look like? From a public sector perspective, it's also important to provide equal access to education, mostly in our science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. And this is something that has started, but we need some more push on it. We also need to promote digital literacy among women who are already in the workforce. But also, we need to be mindful of gender responsive policies that addresses discrimination, that addresses disparities in access and opportunities. Everything has to be equal for all of us. I'll leave the private sector perspective to Treasure.
Thank you, Thelma. I think what I would just say is, for me, a big question about the direction we're going as a continent is to what extent we can do so well in this empowerment and inclusion agenda that we are able to really see the impact of that on the lives of the majority of people. It is about welfare effects. It is about shared prosperity. And for me, I'm worried if we're driving in a way where perhaps an elite that, takes advantage of this momentum, and then a widening disparity, which is what we've seen at the global level, unfortunately.
In this conversation, we're exploring the cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. But I'm curious, how do you see the development partners being involved?
Yes, so maybe I would focus on the cooperation with development partners. In my short time of working in this space, I realized one major issue that has to change is from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach. It's important to listen to the people on the ground, what is the actual need, and there's also the need to showcasing what the problem is to be able to, increase their attention and be more intentional in solving the problem. And being more intentional means actually solving the problem. We can pretend that we are solving the problem by every 8th March putting up flyers, or we can actually be intentional to solve the problem.
When it comes to institution building, I feel that private sector development and supporting that is one of the areas that both governments and development partners can play, because in that way, we are going to see the emergence of more sustainability. And what does it require? Speed and scale. I think the continent has been a continent of many experiments. And I think institutions like Smart Africa can tell us what works and doesn't work. Why don't we just take those models and scale them up? Thank you.
Thank you both so very much for taking the time to chat. And thank you for all of your amazing insights and for giving us guidance on how we should continue to design and implement our projects mindfully, so that at the end, we can build an inclusive data economy of the future.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.
Women Leading Digital is brought to you by GIZ, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, and is produced by Bear Radio. I am Martina Karaparusheva. Follow GIZ for more information, news and stories on digital transformation and gender at www.bmz-digital.global, and make sure to listen to other episodes of this series.